Hello, hi there. Thank you so much for inviting me. Today's seminar is focused on healthy aging in the 21st century, but actually the focus is how we can answer questions about healthy aging with a cross-generational life course approach. The life course approach, well, is very intuitive in the sense that, if we want to answer questions about the human condition, important questions like, okay, how long will I live? I mean, why some people live longer than others? Why some people are healthy and some others are not? Or some people are happy, some others are not. Which and people go to university? Why? Various things about jobs, partnerships and so on. The life course approach is intuitive, and it's no coincidence that a lot of disciplines, partially in parallel, have developed a lot of life course theory, psychology, sociology, epidemiology, and so on. Now, of course, despite the life course approach being very intuitive, having life course data is not so straightforward. We need to follow people from birth, across a life course, and so on. It's not so straightforward. And actually, we need data in order to be able to do science, right? There's no science without data. There's no science without measurement. So we need this kind of data. Luckily, in the UK, we're actually very, very lucky. We do have life course data, not from one, but from many generations. In the Center for Longitudinal Studies where I work, the core business of the center is that we host 4 cohorts. These are highlighted in bold. You can see they're highlighted. The 1958 British birth cohort, a birth cohort born 1958, nationally representative. The 1970 British cohort study, similar cohort born 1970. Next steps, not a birth cohort, but a cohort followed from adolescent onwards of people born in 1989 and 1990. And of course, the Millennium cohort study, followed from birth from the year 2000 onwards. Recently, we have expanded our family of cohorts that includes now the 1946 British birth cohort, the oldest birth cohort, and very exciting news, it includes new birth cohorts, including the UK-wide new exciting birth cohort generation, new era, that will collect data for the first time in 2026. So great, fantastic stuff. We do have all this data. Now, when a unique feature, a defining feature of this design, the fact that we have all the data across the life course of various generations, allows for a very important contribution, which is to understand the impact of social change on people's lives. And this is quite important. So demographic shifts, social change, what is their impact on people's lives across the life course of various generations. And this is a unique defining feature of the set series of studies we have across the life course from 1946, and of course generation new era that will start next year in 2026. Okay, so we do have all this data, but what kind of questions we can answer, at least in theory, with this data? Now, so I have an example of some questions there that are related to healthy aging, so healthy aging through the cross-generational life course lens, but these are just some examples. So for example, we can answer questions about, obviously, the long-term effects of early life circumstances, very important. Intergenerational cycles in poverty and health, what drives those cycles and what are the consequences, life course transitions of massive importance. For example, when it comes to aging, retirement is a very important life course transition, and so what happens around there and so on, but there are many other transitions, of course. Inequalities, great strength of the British birth cohorts, including intersectional inequalities. Quality of life, functioning, productivity post the onset of chronic illness. Very important questions about aging that, of course, is very much linked with health span versus the lifespan, that the birth cohorts are allowed to be investigated through a life course lens, unique feature of the cohorts. Life course determinants of positive aging, very important. Reversibility, resilience. There are many experiences, negative experiences that can happen across the life course, but what mitigates the impact of those? Reversibility and resilience, right? That is a great strength of the cohorts. Of course, the changing experience of different generations, as well as understanding the impact of external shocks, like the pandemic, of the cost of living crisis, and having data across the life course actually allows this. Now, you may be thinking, great, a lot of questions, right? But do we actually have data to answer those questions? Actually, yes. And this is one of the great unique features of all these cohorts. They are very, very, very rich in data, very rich. I wish I had 20 days, not 20 minutes to tell you all about this data, but these are just some examples of the data we have from birth, school years, adulthood, and so on. A lot of data. The great thing about a lot of areas there that you can use this data to answer questions about, but doesn't stop there. These are not just surveys. It's more than that. This is a word salad, I know. We do happen to have all of those things, all of those words that are mentioned there, all of these aspects of people's lives. We do have this data. But to give you an example, this data are also fully genotyped. So there's this perspective. We also have data on epigenetics. Yes, of course, we have data on employment, housing, everything with family life, everything was mentioned there. Aging, of course, has a very prominent role nowadays in these studies. These are not just surveys, they are linked with electronic health records, for example, that are available via the UK Longitudinal Linkage Collaboration. Very soon, there will be linked data with the Department of Work and Pensions data. There are linked data with education and so on with those surveys, with those British birth cohorts. They're not just surveys, they're much, much, much more. It doesn't stop there. We do have information on address level of where cohort members live. Of course, this means we can link geographical data, area level characteristics to answer important questions. Of course, these are, for example, this is something, the example on the obesogenic environment. It's not just that. We can link or have linked already various other area level characteristics. So these are not just surveys, right? It's much more than that. A very important aspect of these surveys is that the data are freely available. And they are freely available in the UK Data Service. So you can log in, create an account, and download the data, download the survey data from all these British cohorts. Now, of course, some more sensitive data, there's some other processes, but roughly speaking, within a month, you have access to this data. You would have access to this data as well, for example, genetics and so on. You can get a lot of information about this data by visiting the Center for Longitudinal Studies website, which has information about all things cohorts, really, from questionnaires to information on methods to handle missing data, mode effects, and so on. Visit our website. All things about cohorts are available there. Great lot of information. Last but not least about data, before I move on to a couple of examples that I believe are important when it comes to the cohorts and aging. We just deposited data from the 1958 National Child Development Study, 1958 British birth cohort. We just deposited data from age 62. The data were deposited in July, and they're of course freely available. Please download them and use them. And of course, we deposited data from the 1970 British birth cohort earlier on in February from age 51. And of course, this data are available as all the surveys across the life course from birth are available to you to use them. Please use this data. Okay, so this is about the data, but I wanted to also give you some examples of findings, right? Not speak just about the data. Perhaps obviously, but the impact of early life on various outcomes, social, economic, health outcomes later on, in adulthood, but also in later life, the actual empirical evidence of this comes from the British birth cohorts. There's so much evidence, for example, that early life's economic position, the socioeconomic position of the parents of the cohort members matters quite a lot across the life course. It doesn't stop there. There are many other early life characteristics. I will give you an example of one which is quite unique to the cohorts. Early life mental health. Early life mental health has been shown time and again across generations to impact social, health, and economic outcomes, life chances in general, across the life course, and so on. But it also has a strong influence on a very important outcome, how long we live, on mortality. So this is a paper we published a couple of years ago. And in this paper, we grouped cohort members according to mental health symptoms, whether they have experienced mental health symptoms in adolescence, in childhood and adolescence. So you have 4 lines there representing probability of survival up to age 58. And you have 4 lines. The blue lines represent those with, we call it the stable low group, no mental health symptoms in childhood and adolescence. The green line is moderate symptoms, moderate mental health symptoms in childhood and adolescence. Adolescent onset represents the group that had the onset of mental health symptoms in adolescence, and stable high, the orange line that represents the probability of survival of the group of participants that had mental health symptoms across childhood and adolescence. And that, as I think is hopefully is very easy to see in terms of probability of survival. Those, for example, with mental health symptoms across childhood and adolescence, they had the lowest probability of survival. Those without any mental health symptoms across childhood and adolescence had the highest probability of survival. So early life does matter, and matters not only for various outcomes, but actually the most important outcome, perhaps how long we live. But of course, the cohorts do not only stop there. We have information, let's say, on mental health across the life course. You see there, on the left-hand side, a paper we published again a couple of years ago, and this is about psychological distress in adulthood up until age 68 in this instance. 3 generations born in 1946, the red line, the green line, baby boomers born 1958, and the blue line, Generation X, born 1970. And this is the mean number of symptoms. And we see there 2 important findings. First of all, that having data across the life course, we can find out which is the period with the highest levels of distress, midlife. I can relate to this, just to say. Also, another important observation is that at the same age plotted on the x-axis, of course, age in years, those with Generation X have higher symptoms of psychological distress. So some early signs there of what we call the generational health drift. On the right-hand side, you see the comparison is between Gen Z and millennials, and you see that those born in the year 2000 up to 2002, they have higher prevalence of mental health symptoms. This is a score on the SDQ. They have higher SDQ score, the emotional score of the SDQ, at the same age. So you see evidence there from the British cohorts, trajectories of mental health. You see evidence of what we call the generational health drift. There is more than that, of course. You can create trajectories of obesity, of being overweight and obesity, 5 generations there, starting from 1946 and going up to those born in the Millennium Cohort Study. This is the probability of overweight and obesity in males and females. You see there that, well, you see evidence of the obesity epidemic. But having data across generations shows 2 things. First of all, okay, younger generations are more likely to have a probability of being overweight or obese. But then one other important observation that can actually allow us to start thinking about the mechanisms that drive the obesity epidemic. As you can see in the 3 older cohorts, up to Generation X, the divergence in the probability of being overweight or obese starts in early adulthood. It's not there in childhood and adolescence. However, in early life, in the younger cohorts, this divergence exists earlier on in life as well, in childhood and adolescence. And that can give us some ideas about the obesity epidemic, about the mechanisms that may underlie the obesity epidemic. Now, a lot of information, we have done a lot of work on this, a lot of information on health across generations, across the life course, that we have observed a trend that we call the generational health drift, that more recently born cohorts, post-war generation in the UK, are experiencing worse health at the same age compared to older generations. And we have observed this in various outcomes, including obesity, mental health, diabetes, poor self-rated health, and so on. Now, of course, the cohorts do not only include information about health, they're very rich, as I've just mentioned. This is an example about working life histories by age 55 in the 1958 British birth cohort. The various colors, they represent various working life histories. The red is full-time employment, unemployment is deep blue, part-time employment is light blue, education is light green, and so on. And this is in men, fine. And you can see part-time employment by age 55. This is women, and of course you can see some stark differences there, right? Some stark differences. There's less full-time employment this generation and more part-time employment and unemployment. And of course the cohorts not only allow to describe this phenomenon, which is important, but allow to understand antecedents, what drives these working life patterns, but also consequences. When it comes to example for pensions, consequences on pension, what is the consequence? How working life history shape pensions, retirement, and so on. Of course, speaking of consequences about working life histories, the cohorts are very rich in data, and we include information about income. So that's net family income across a working lifetime, again in the same generation, born in 1958. What you see there is the 2 things. First of all, you see inequalities expanding from age 23 to age 50. You see that those in the 19th centile have much higher income they have compared to those in the 10th centile, right, and so on. So there's quite a lot there and to unpack about the impact of work on income and so on, and also how inequalities actually are exacerbated across the life course. Again, speaking about income and about consequence, something very important life transition that happens, which is related to aging, is of course retirement. And we have been doing quite a lot of work on NCDS with this data. That NCDS, as we speak, actually they have reached state pension age. So we're planning a new cohort data collection on these cohorts to understand what happens just post-retirement. But in the latest data that we have deposited, age 62, we were able to actually answer a lot of questions about how much people save for retirement, right? Their savings and so on. So these are just some results for a report we are developing for the Department of Work and Pensions. So this is NCDS, the 1958 British birth cohort. This is the average net value of defined benefit pensions for men and women and overall. For example, there you see some inequality, males and females. Men have, higher, the amount is higher. If you look at defined contribution, stark differences there as well. And this, of course, you can think of it as perhaps a consequence of the working life history of men and women in this generation. So we have a lot of those type of examples. Now, there is so much more, right? And I wish I had more time, and very happy to answer questions during the Q&A about, many more examples about how this data can be used to understand various aspects of aging. I hope I gave you some good examples, and I have inspired you to use the data, because that's the more important thing, right? We want you to use this fantastic and amazing data. But to summarize a little bit about today, what I have presented, the British birth cohorts, they allow for the cross-generational life course approach to healthy aging, to aging generally. And this is unique to the British birth cohorts. No other data on the planet allows this. These are true life course, these allow for the true life course approach with prospective data. Yes, the prospective life course data are great. I love the ELSA, SEAR, and so on, all the other studies, but having prospective data has a lot of advantages. They are not just life course surveys. They include various data enhancements. I gave you a lot of examples today. Please use these data enhancements as well. Of course, these rich life course data make assumptions on various methodological challenges much more plausible. Challenge about attrition, selective attrition, or challenge about causal inference and measurement error. The fact that we have rich life course data allows these assumptions to be much more plausible. We have done quite a lot of work on this. For example, how despite selective attrition of these cohorts, we can restore sample representativeness. Last but not least, the rich life course data across generations allow for policy relevant research. And this is quite important. Of course, it's very important to inform scientific knowledge, the scientific consensus. The cohorts have done this for many years and will continue to do this, but the rich data that the cohort include allow also for very policy relevant research.
Hi, I'm Athina Vlachantoni, based in the University of Southampton, and I'll be presenting the preliminary findings from an ESRC-funded project on pension protection among minority ethnic communities in the UK. This project involves 3 more colleagues, Yuan Yin from the Winchester School of Art, and Spela Mojknik and Sadaf Naz Akhtar from the Centre for Research on Aging and Department of Gerontology in Southampton. So the background to this project is that the UK as a country is both aging and also becoming more ethnically diverse. Currently, the proportion of non-ethnic minority population is about 14%, and it's expected to increase significantly into the future. It's predicted to exceed 20% by 2051. At the same time, we know that later life reflects an accumulation of experiences and resources from across the life course for individuals. And we also know from existing research that for older individuals from specific Black and minority ethnic communities, later life comes with a higher risk of having lower financial resources, and as a result, a higher risk of being in poverty. Why is that? It's a complex combination of a number of different things. The first one is structural inequalities that result in ethnic gaps in employment patterns. The second is inequalities that result in ethnic gaps in health. And we know that research has continued to evidence such gaps in spite of progress in the redistribution of health resources. We also know that there is a UK pension system where the value of the pension is quite low, and that means that the workplace pensions and any personal pensions can make the difference between living in poverty or not. And finally, we know that there is intersectionality in all of these patterns. There is an impact of different characteristics interacting to create an even greater and more complex disadvantage. For example, the combination of ethnic heritage and gender. Previous research that we have done here in the Center for Research on Aging, we saw that compared to white British individuals, specifically working age individuals from Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi communities are less likely to be employed. And when they are employed, they are less likely to be working as an employee and more likely to be working as self-employed. And then when they are working as an employee, they are less likely than other ethnic groups to be working for an employer that offers a workplace pension scheme. And that's before the automatic enrollment scheme was introduced in this country. We also know that for the older age groups, for the individuals who are already retired, specific groups, specific individuals from ethnic minority communities are less likely to be receiving a state pension or a workplace pension, and they're more likely to be receiving means-tested benefits. Other research has also compounded this evidence of disadvantage, relative disadvantage. So for example, we know that there's ethnic inequalities in terms of labor market participation, as well as healthcare access and health status. At the same time, there's been research specifically on minority ethnic communities to show that there are community-level initiatives, such as committees through among Pakistani communities, which are more in line with religious beliefs of those communities in order to support individuals from such backgrounds. I mentioned the introduction of automatic enrollment, and that's important for the context of our research, in the sense that this is the initiative from the government to try to ensure that more individuals who enter the labor market and have a minimum income of £10,000 a year are able to be automatically enrolled in their workplace pension scheme. And that was meant to broaden out pension contribution for younger cohorts coming into the labor market. Our overall aim in this project, which is ongoing until 2026, is to use innovative methods and to provide new empirical evidence on preparing financially for later life among women and men from Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities in the UK. We're looking at a number of different questions. For example, we are exploring whether the gap in pension protection between different minority ethnic communities has closed over the last 20 years. We're interested in how individuals financially prepare for later life and whether there are differences between ethnic communities. We're interested in the role that gender and religion play in such perspectives. And finally, the ultimate goal of our project is to try to inform the design of policies which are much more inclusive in terms of pensions, saving, and retirement. Our project uses a number of methods. Statistical analysis of national data is one that I will focus in this presentation, but also we're using photo voice interviews and focus groups with midlife and older persons. engagement with local community, for example, the local government council and local schools, where we are engaging with pupils at the secondary school age level. And also we're engaging with local and national policymakers like the Department for Work and Pensions. The data we're using is the UK Household Longitudinal Study. We've used data from 2009 until the most recently available at the time of the analysis, 2023. And we're conducting bivariate and multivariate logistic regression analysis to investigate a number of different outcomes. We're looking at ethnic and gender differences in terms of specifically workplace pension membership for working age persons. We're looking at ethnic and gender differences in terms of savings and investments for later life, for retired pensions. And we're also interested in indicators that tell us something about how individuals feel about their own financial situation currently, but also how they expect to view it in the future. Some preliminary findings as we are working through the results of our analysis. We have found that over that space of time that we are investigating, the gaps between the ethnic groups in terms of employment rate have not closed. So we do see individuals from white British communities being most likely to be employed, but we also see important gender gaps within those ethnic differences. So men are more likely to be employed than women, and we see that women of Bangladeshi background are the least likely group among all groups to be in the labor market. Also, we have seen that the proportion of working age individuals who have workplace pension has been increasing. That's really important because it tells us that the policies that the government is introducing are in the right direction. But we also see that the gaps between ethnic groups, although they are closing, they're still existent and they're still very visible. We find that persons specifically from Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities, and specifically women among such communities, they are faring worse than other individuals. And interestingly, we found that individuals from Chinese communities are the most likely to have personal pensions and savings, non-pension savings, expecting to reuse those savings in retirement. That's interesting for us because different ethnic groups have different patterns and histories of migration to the UK, and that affects their financial behavior as well as entitlements within the pension system. Some reflections on using this specific data set for our project. It's a very important data set in terms of ethnic diversity in the sample, and for scholars who are trying to investigate these ethnic differentials, it is an invaluable resource. But in spite of that diversity, we still have challenges in terms of the sample sizes. So particularly for among older ages, sometimes the analysis empirically is not possible. So that means we have to use different ways forward, such as merging, for example, individuals from different Asian groups together. But of course, that goes counter to the idea of trying to investigate differences between different ethnic communities. At the same time, the UK HLS is a very rich data set in terms of demographic, socioeconomic, and health indicators. And that's important because it gives us a more holistic understanding of individuals' well-being. There's also questions that we need to consider about the self-declared ethnic identity of individuals, of respondents, which may have changed over time. But that's a caveat that all self-declared questions present with the researchers with. So overall, I think the UK HLS is a very important data resource in that context of an aging and an increasingly ethnically diverse UK population. Some reflections on what we have found already. So the quantitative analysis has shown that although more working age persons are members of a workplace pension scheme, that ethnic gap is still remaining. So a question for researchers and policymakers is whether we should expect that gap to slowly close and how long it might take to close in the future. We've identified specific groups which are faring worse. So individuals from Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities, they are still less likely to be in paid work as employees and to make the most of workplace pensions and savings. On the other hand, we found that Chinese individuals are faring well in terms of expecting to use non-pension savings in retirement. Importantly, for going back to the point about intersectionality, gender gaps continue, and we see that women from Bangladeshi and Pakistani communities are the ones who are faring the worst in terms of any indicator that we use. So these are pervasive gender differences which continue in terms of the division of paid and unpaid labor, and that feeds into pension entitlements. So what does that mean in terms of policies? Well, ethnicity and gender, either separately or together, they continue to play a very important role in terms of how individuals prepare and are ready financially for later life. What does that tell us in terms of thinking of a more inclusive pension protection system? So the first point is about addressing structural constraints. So this is about removing barriers into high-paid occupations, raising educational attainment among all groups, tackling ethnic and gender pay gaps, but also addressing the high cost and availability of childcare, which is a factor affecting women's participation specifically. Cultural factors are also very important. So in this sense, widening the offer of Sharia compliant pension products is a good way forward. For the UK context specifically, investigating the reasons why individuals might opt out is also very important, from specific groups. And finally, improving pension protection for self-employed individuals can go some way, given that we know that individuals from specific communities are more likely to be self-employed than employed. Thank you for your attention. If you would like to know more about our project, you can follow the website on the slide.
Hi, I'm Bram Vanhoutte, and I'll be talking to you about some recent research that I did together with Akinosho El Muxitu. The topic of this research is subjective age, and I'll be talking to you about how it evolves over time longitudinally using the English longitudinal study of aging, as well as how functional limitations have a role in the gap between subjective aging and chronological age. Subjective age is the idea that age is an internalized mental state and not just an objective characteristic. It's a key aspect of identity that is independent of our chronological age. Just as the gentleman here on the picture, when we think of our own age, often our kind of mental or subjective age is different from our chronological age. Why is it relevant to study something like subjective age? Well, because unlike with gender and class and other key categories of our identities, we don't tend to think of age in a multidimensional way. We haven't really theorized much around age. Often it's just a confounder in many studies. And using something like subjective age as an outcome measure might help us shift the study of aging from kind of medicalized biosocial perspective to a more psychosocial view of age as a construction. Internalized dispositions such as subjective age, but also self-rated health or subjective social status, can be important as an objective indicator, as they sometimes carry more predictive power than objective measures do. For example, there's a robust association between a lower subjective age and various health outcomes. one of the things we wanted to investigate in our study is if cohort differences in subjective aging exist. So if there are any differences between earlier born and later born people in how they evaluate their age. Why would there be any cohort differences? Well, each cohort ages under unique historical conditions, so it's likely that they will age differently. This might mean they have a different health at a given age. This might mean they have different beliefs about what aging means, but it could also reflect material differences in living conditions. At the same time, not just the people have changed, the cohorts, but the context also changes. Digitalization, which is pervasive and everywhere in our lives, potentially makes people feel older earlier. And in recent times, we've seen that ageism is potentially more rampant. For example, during the COVID pandemic or in the discussions around the age of President Biden. The second subject we want to address is the relation between health and subjective age. So from earlier research, we already know that health explains a large part of the variation in subjective age. But there's limited longitudinal evidence on the effect of physical health on subjective age. It's clear that less good health status is clearly associated with feeling closer to one's age, but we also don't know if there's differences about the influence of cognitive or versus physical health limitations. So these are some things we want to investigate further. So the focus of our study is on these three research questions. First, we want to establish how the gap between subjective and chronological age evolves over time by cohort, but also how functional health issues affect the evolution of the subjective age gap, and lastly, what the impact is of onset of a functional limitation on this age differential. The data we will be using to explore these research questions are the English longitudinal study of aging. This longitudinal panel study of about 10,000 community residing people over 50 in England covers a wide array of subjects, from health and well-being to caring and social participation. Data collection for this panel takes place every 2 years with a nurse visit to take blood and hair samples for biomarkers, as well as performing certain tests every 4 years. The sample is updated every wave so that it remains representative of the population. It's also part of a wider international framework of studies on aging and comparable with studies such as the Health and Retirement Study in the US or SHARE in Europe. It's freely accessible through the UK Data Service for researchers. Some descriptive statistics on subjective age in the ELSA population. So as you see, the number of participants was about 7,500 to 10,000, depending on the wave, and on average, respondents were about 65 years old. But they felt about 10 years younger. It's the difference between felt age and chronological age that we will be examining here. Important to note is that we have a 10-year follow-up for respondents who took part in all waves. Our main measure of health is limitation in instrumental or general activities of daily living, two commonly used scales to assess functional health in later life. While ADL refers more directly to physical health, IADL refers more to instrumental organizational aspects of health that also imply being in good cognitive health. We will assess the influence of each scale separately in our study. And so as you can see, activities of daily living are activities such as washing, toileting, dressing, feeding, walking or transferring from bed to the room, while IADLs are things like cooking, house cleaning, shopping, personal finances, and transport. In terms of methods, we will first investigate the evolution of the subjective age gap over age, conditional on cohort, by using age vector graphs. That's an application of random intercept multi-level models, which I will explain in a second. The last research question on the effect of onset of a health limitation requires a fixed effects approach, examining only the change in the age gap within those respondents for whom there is a change in functional health status. So how will we examine our first research question to examine if there's cohort differences in this age gap? For that, we will use age vector graphs, which were first used by Mirovsky and Kim in 2007. What are these age vector graphs? Well, they're tools to create synthetic cohort trajectories over age, and they enable visualizing how an outcome evolves over age for each cohort. A key assumption in this approach is that there is no period effect. As you can see, technically, in terms of modeling, the model without adjustment takes the form of a random intercept multi-level growth model that models time, cohort, and their interaction. So this visual tool to interpret growth model results with shows us how a specific age cohort evolves over time, and each cohort has its own trajectory. So here we see the results in terms of the age vector model. It models how subjective age evolves over time for a specific cohort. For example, the first line shows us the 52-year-olds in wave 1, that's 2004, and it shows how they've evolved over this period of 10 years. We see that these 52-year-olds have actually increased in the gap, so the gap, which is modeled on the x-axis here, increases. It goes from around 7 to around 11. So these 52-year-olds in wave 1 on average feel 45 years old. They're about 7 years. They feel about 7 years younger, and 10 years later at 62 they feel about 51. So we can see that the gap between felt age and chronological age increases over age for all cohorts, but slightly steeper so for the youngest cohorts. For example, having a look here at a different cohort, those who were aged 70 in 2004 felt 60 back then, and 10 years later they feel around 67 and a half on average. So we can state that on average we age slower subjectively than chronologically, and time passes faster than we age in our head. We age about a third slower subjectively than we do chronologically. So that was the model in terms of age effects. If you look at this same model, so conditional without any adjustment made for other factors, just cohort and time, we can see that the cohort effects are there. So there is an increase in the age gap between cohorts. Later born cohorts do feel younger than earlier born cohorts did at the same age. For example, 60-year-olds in 2004 felt 9 years younger, while 60-year-olds in 2014, 10 years later, felt 11 years younger. This trend of increasing gap between felt age and chronological age at a given age is clear for all cohorts, and it looks stronger for the older cohorts than the younger one. It looks stronger at older ages than at younger ages. So here are some results from the adjusted regression models presented in a forest plot. So on the left, we see the model with IADL, on the right with ADL. The red line marks the neutral point. The dot marks the estimate, and the whiskers mark the confidence interval for each coefficient. So 3 remarkable associations here, and they're a bit similar as you see in both the models with IDA and AIDL. Firstly, we see a very large effect of functional limitations, and they're in the same ballpark. For IADL and ADL, respondents with one limitation reported an age gap that was on average about 3 years less or 6 years less if there's more than one limitation. Lower educated respondents and men felt closer to their age in comparison to middle levels of education and women. Interestingly, respondents who report they are divorced feel a larger age gap and hence feel younger than people who are married and who have the same age cohort, educational level, and level of limitations. As stated, functional health seems to be very important for the subjective age gap, but the reported association in the multi-level model is the combination of two things, actually. On the one hand, there's selection into a group that will have a functional disability with possibly already a smaller subjective age gap before onset, and the actual causal effect of onset of functional disability in the panel. So in this study, we wanted to separate both effects, and in a multi-level growth model, you can't. So we had to switch to a different technique, fixed effects. So to isolate this effect of onset, we used a fixed effects model which examines only within-person change. This, of course, substantially reduces our dataset, as only people who report a change in ADL or IADL, we again stratified here, in the panel remain in our sample. So as you see, onset of one limitation in instrumental activity of daily life diminishes the gap with about 1.25 years. From at least two IDL with more than 2.5 years. So onset of one ADL has a slightly more limited but significant effect, while two or more ADLs diminish the gap with around 2.5 years. So these results show that there's a clear causal effect of onset of limitation, but it is less than half of the reported effect in the earlier multi-level mixed effects models. So there are significant selection effects as well, with certain groups already reporting feeling closer to their age before experiencing a limitation. Important to interpret these effects is to understand that there is about 2 years between the waves, so that the reported effect in a change is a change in the subjective age gap on the middle long term, and that the immediate effect of onset might be larger. But it does appear that onset of limitations, especially more than one at the same time, makes us feel substantially older. Some conclusions of this research: subjective aging happens on average about a third to a quarter slower than chronological aging in later life. With increasing age, the gap between how old we feel and how old we are increases, and even more so for younger cohorts. Functional health plays a key role in how old we feel, especially in early old age, and the onset of functional health limitations makes us age 1 to 2.5 years overnight. A key and very important limitation of this research is that these results might be affected by attrition, as healthier people stay in the panel for longer, so there might be selection effects influencing our estimates. But it is clear that subjective age has potential as a mental marker of age, and future work could study the variability of these trajectories. Here we've just focused on the average, as well as studying links with the life course, given that divorce in later life makes you feel younger, apparently. This research was published in the Journals of Gerontology, and you can find the link here. Thank you.